Chapter 8, it's about the skeletal system. In this chapter, we're going to learn about the different bones that we have within the skeleton. And just as a reminder, within the skeletal system, we have two types of connective tissue, which are bone and cartilage. All the bones that we have are made of an outer layer of compact bone and an inner mass of a spongy bone that in long bones is mainly replaced by a medullary cavity. And different bones have different amounts of compact bone or spongy bone. Compact bone, it is used in our skeletal system primarily to carry weight, while the medullary cavity and the areas around the spongy bone, we have stem cells that are important for the formation of blood cells and platelets. Cartilage will be found at endings of long bones in free articulations, free moving articulations where we will have a lot of movement, and this is for protection. The type of cartilage that we have in these articulations or joints will be called the articular cartilage, and remember, is made out of hyaline cartilage. Now, unlike bone, cartilage does not have its own blood supply, so this cartilage type of tissue, it is known as avascular. We have two major divisions of the skeletal system. The axial skeleton, that it has the bones that are found in the center of the body, like the skull bone, the vertebrae, hyoid bones, the ribs, and the sternum. The appendicular skeleton will be found in our limbs and includes the shoulder and pelvic girdles. We have 206 bones in the typical adult skeleton, and we have within the adult skeleton some bones that are called sesamoid bones that develop within tendons, and the only one that counts towards these 206 bones will be the patella or kneecap. These other type of bones that we have within the adult skeleton will be something that we call the sutural or Wormian bones. These are located in the connections between the bones of the skull that are called the sutures. And these Wormian bones are not counted towards the number of bones in the typical adult skeleton. When we're born with 270 bones, but as we are growing, some of these bone fuses and form a single bone, and then we end up with 206 bones. So this is the distribution of the bones within the skeletal system or the skeleton. So in here we have the axial bones in beige color, and we have the appendicular skeleton in green color. So this is the name and distribution of the bones of the axial and the appendicular skeleton. So within the axial skeleton, we have the skull bones, which are 22, and they are subdivided into cranial bones and into facial bones. The cranial bones, some of them are paired and some of them are single. The ones that are single will be frontal bone, occipital bone, and sphenoid bone. The paired bones will be parietal bones, the temporal bones, and the ethmoid bones. Another type of bones that we have within the skull will be the facial bones, and we have two maxilla, two palatine bones, two zygomatic bones, two lacrimal bones, two nasal bones, two inferior nasal conchae, and then we have single bones like the vomer and the mandible. Inside our ears, we have the auditory ossicles, which we have 3 on each ear. So we have malleus, incus, and stapes on the left ear, and we have the same bones on the right ear. In the neck, we have the hyoid bone, which is the only unarticulated bone in our body. It's only held by ligaments and muscles into its position within the neck. The vertebral column consists of different bones. We have 7 cervical vertebrae, which are located within the neck. We have 12 thoracic vertebrae, which are located within the thorax. We have 5 lumbar vertebrae, which are found in the lumbar area. And we have the sacrum and the coccyx, which are located within the pelvic area. Now, in the thoracic cage, we have 24 ribs, 12 on each side, and we have in the mid anterior portion of the thoracic cage, we have the sternum. The appendicular skeleton, it is composed of the pectoral girdle, which has this scapula and the clavicles, which are 4 bones. They are pair bones, so we have in the left and the right a scapula and a clavicle. Within the upper limbs, we have 60 bones, like the humerus, radius, ulna, the carpal bones, the metacarpal bones, and phalanges. Now, these bones that we have, the phalanges, which will be the bones that we have in our fingers, they don't have a different name. They have the same name, but you just have different number for them, and that makes it easier to learn these names. Now, within the pelvic girdle, we have the coxal bones or hip bones, which we have 2. And then within our lower limb, we have 60 bones, which are 28 phalanges, similar as to what we have in the hand. We have 10 metacarpal bones. We have the tarsal bones, which will be located within the tarsal area or the ankle. And then we have the fibula, tibia, patella, or the kneecaps, and the femurs, which are the thigh bone. At some point, this count of 206 bones, it's kind of scary, but it is not, because many of these bones, they have the same name, but they are located in the right or left of our body, and that brings the count to like 103 bones. And if you take into account the number of bones that we have in the phalanges or within the hands in the feet, that number is greatly reduced to learn. So we end up just out of these 100 that we have, learning also only the number of around 50 to 60 bones. Now, the bones are not featureless. They are not smooth. They have bumps and ridges or holes, and these are what we call the bone markings. The bone markings have different names, and they have different function. So we have markings that help to form articulations. We have markings that are extensions and projections. We have markings that are depressions or groove. We have markings that forms cavities or a passage. And these are the markings that helps to form articulation. So we have a condyle, which is a rounded projection that will articulate with another bone. Usually with a depression that we call a fossa. Now, another marking that helps to make articulations will be the facets. The facets are smooth surfaces that can be flat or slightly concave, or sometimes they can be convex, and helps to form an articulation. We have heads, which are large projections that are located above a neck. And sometimes this head is completely round, like in the case of the head of the femur or the head of the humerus. We have also extensions and projections. So we have these extensions and projections that majorly help for the attachment of muscles or ligaments. So we have a crest, which is a narrow ridge, and we have very different examples. We will see those, but we have a crest in the iliac bone that is located within the pelvis. We have an epicondyle, which is a raised area above a condyle. These rounded knobs that we have that makes articulations. We have lines which are similar to crest, but these are slightly raised, so they are much thinner, and they are elongated ridges. We have also processes, which are any bony prominence. We have protuberance, which are at some point a little bit smaller than processes. It's like an outgrowth of a bone or a protruding part. We also have spines, which are sharp and slender projections, or that are narrow processes. Now we have blunt projections like trochanters, which are very massive and they are irregular in their surface. And we also have tubercles, which are similar to tuberosities, but the tuberosity is a rough elevated surface, while the tubercles are small rounded processes. Now within the depressions we have alveolus, which is a pit or a socket, like in the case of the tooth sockets. We also have shallow depressions that we call fossas, and this helps to connect to condyles. We also have foveas, which are small pits, so they are similar to the fossas, but they are very tiny. We can also have a depression like a sulcus, which is a groove for a tendon or a nerve or a blood vessel to pass. We can also have these passages or cavities like canals. Canals are tubular passages or tunnels in the bones. We have the example of the auditory canal, which is the external portion of our ear that help us to bring the waves of vibration that creates the sound. We can also have slits like fissures, and these slits or fissures allows also the passage of blood vessels and nerves. Example, we have the supraorbital or infraorbital fissures in our eyes, in our orbits. We also have foramen, which is the name for a hole through the bone and is usually round, like the foramen magnum of the occipital bone. Now, foramen will be the name for singular holes, while if you have multiple, that will be called foramina. We also can have a meatus, which is similar to canals. You can call, for instance, this auditory canal, you can call it also the auditory meatus or acoustic meatus. We also have cavities filled with air, like in the case of sinuses, that helps to create like a resonance chamber and lighten the skull. So here there are some examples of the markings of the bones. So here we have a couple of lines that are important for the attachment of a muscle in here that is called the temporalis muscle. And then we have here a meatus or a canal. Here we have a condyle of this bone that is called the mandible, and then this condyle articulates with the fossa in this bone that is called the temporal bone. And then we have a slender sharp projection that is a spine, and then we have foramen in here, and we have an alveolus or socket here in the mandibular bone, and then another foramen, and then we have cavities filled with air like these sinuses. This is the frontal sinus, this is the sphenoidal sinus. Here within the scapula, we have this projection that is called the spine, and then we have depressions. This is the supraspinous fossa and infraspinous fossa. And then in here, in the femur, we have a line, we have trochanters, we have a crest, we have a head, and a tiny pit in here that is called the fovea capitis. And then in here within the arm bone, which is called the humerus, we have a tuberosity that it's a little bit bigger than a tubercle. Then we have the head, and this will be the neck. This is the neck of the femur. Then we have these tubercles in here. This will be fossa in here, and we have another fossas in here. We have epicondyles, which are raised areas above condyles, which are these ones in here. And then we will learn individual markings for each bone. Now about the skull. The skull, it has 22 bones, and these bones are joined by immovable joints that we call the sutures. The bones in the skull helps to protect the brain and the associated vessels and the structures within our nervous system. We have several cavities within the skull, and they are the cranial cavity or brain case. We have the orbital cavity or orbits, which are eye sockets. We have the nasal cavity. We have the oral or buccal cavity, which is our mouth. And then we have the ear cavities, which are subdivided into middle, internal, and we have also the paranasal sinuses. Now the bones in the skull, they are filled with a lot of foramina because this is the structure in our body that helps to protect our brain, and our brain has to communicate with the rest of the body. So this foramina helps to allow the passage for nerves and blood vessels. While the paranasal sinuses that we have here around the nose, these are important, as I told you before, to act as a resonance chamber and to lighten the skull. And these inside are lined with mucosa, with an epithelium that helps to prevent the dryness of these sinuses. And we have this air that is supposed to flow between the sinuses and the nasal cavity. This is the anterior view of these sinuses. So here we have the frontal sinuses above the orbit, which is this area. Then in here we have the ethmoidal cells and or sinuses, and then here on the sides of the nose we have the maxillary sinuses, and this will be the mid-sagittal cut of the skull showing you these cavities. So we have here the frontal sinuses, which are the second largest sinuses. Then in here we have the maxillary sinuses, which are the biggest sinuses that we have, the largest. And then we have here the ethmoidal cells or sinus, and then we have these sphenoid sinuses within this bone that is called the sphenoid bone. And this will be the cranial fossa. This is the frontal section of the head, just to show you that we have some cavities, like in the case of the mouth will be the oral cavity, this will be the nasal cavity, and then here we have the frontal sinus, here we have the maxillary sinuses, etc. So the cranium helps to protect the brain, but the cranium is separated from the brain by membranes that we call the meninges. These meninges are very important for the protection of the brain, and one of these meninges, which we have three, is called the dura mater. This is the thickest membrane that it is in close contact with the cranium, and it helps to divide the different areas of the cranial cavity. So we have the anterior cranial fossa that holds the frontal lobe of our brain. We have the middle cranial fossa that holds the temporal lobes of our brain, and we have the posterior cranial fossa that contains the cerebellum and part of the occipital lobe of our brain. So we have within our cranium, or within our skull, we have 8 cranial bones. These are flat bones that are connected by sutures, and they will be the frontal bone, which is not paired, 2 parietal bones left and right. We have 2 temporal bones left and right. We have the occipital bone, which is located posteriorly in the skull. This will be unpaired. Then we have the keystone, or the bone that connects all the other bones of the skull, which will be the sphenoid. And finally we have the ethmoid bone, And this ethmoid bone, along with parts of the temporal and occipital bones, makes up the base of the skull. So here we have the different fossa. So this will be the anterior cranial fossa, this will be the middle cranial fossa, and this will be the posterior cranial fossa. So the parts that are protected by the fossas will be anterior cranial fossa protects the frontal lobe, the middle cranial fossa protects the temporal lobe of our brain, and the posterior cranial fossa protects not only the cerebellum but also the occipital bone. And this is the superior view of the skull without the brain. So you can see here the anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa, and then the posterior cranial fossa. Now within the frontal bone, we have different features. So the cranial bone, it is the most anterior and superior bone that we have in the skull. And this bone has a middle portion just above the root of our nose that it is called the glabella. On the sides of the glabella, we have this supraorbital margin. And then closer to the bridge of the nose, we have the supraorbital foramen. Now the frontal bone makes this anterior and superior portion of our skull, but also if you see here inside in this orange color as this bone is depicted in here, it forms part of the internal portion of our orbit and also the lateral and medial portion of the orbit. The parietal bones, which are these ones in here, this is the lateral view and this is the superior view. They don't have that many features. They only have part of these temporal lines that helps to connect the temporalis muscle here on our temples. Now these temporal lines not only are part of the parietal bone, but also they are part of this frontal bone, as you can see here. Now the parietal bone makes connections, the right and the left. This connection between the two parietal bones is called the sagittal suture. Now within the anterior area of our skull, which is this, and in the superior view, you can also see another suture that connects the frontal lobe to the parietal, connects the frontal bone with the parietal bones. This will be called the frontal or coronal suture. And then in the posterior view of the skull, in the posterior superior view, and even in the lateral in here, you can see the connection between the occipital bone and the parietal bone, which is called the lambdoid suture. Now the lambdoid suture runs also here into the temporal bone. So this is the temporal bone. So here the lambdoid suture is between the occipital, parietal, and the temporal bones. Now laterally, here you can see also the frontal or coronal suture. And we have here this suture between the temporal bone, which is this, and the parietal bone, which is called the squamous suture. So these will be the major sutures connecting the skull bones. So here you can see better view of the lateral surface of the skull. So this is the frontal bone connecting to the parietal bone through this coronal suture. Here you have the temporal bone connecting to the parietal bone into what we call the squamous suture. And then in here we have the temporal bone and the parietal bone connecting to the occipital bone, this one in green, through what we call the lambdoid suture. Now, one bone that you can see here also on the lateral surface of the skull, it is the sphenoid. The sphenoid is the keystone, so every single bone in the skull connects to the sphenoid. And as well, you can see here the ethmoid bone, the other bone of the skull. So this is the base of the skull. And within the base of the skull, as I said before, you have important structures or bones. So here we have these bones that protects our base of our brain, that it is very important to keep us alive. So we have here the sphenoid and the temporal and occipital bones here in the superior view. And something that you can see here in the anterior cranial fossa will be the upper part of the ethmoid bone, which is this. Now, some features that you can see in the superior view with the open cranial floor. So you can see the frontal bone, which is this, and then here in this area in between the right and the left frontal bones, we have, or in between the middle part of the frontal bone, the left and right parts of the frontal bone, we have the ethmoid with this projection that is called the crista galli, which is a projection where the meninge, the strongest meninge, the dura mater, connect into there. Now we also have in the ethmoid these holes that are called the cribriform foramina. This cribriform foramina helps for the nerves of the olfactory nerve to pass into the brain. The olfactory nerve, it's a cranial nerve that helps us to smell. Now the sphenoid, which you can see here in blue color, will have this upper part that it is part of the anterior cranial fossa. This will be the lesser wings of the sphenoid, and this will be the greater wings of the sphenoid. Here on the sides of the lesser wings, you can see the optic canal. So we have a nerve that is called the optic nerve, or cranial nerve number 2, that passes through this. This will be the nerve that makes us see. Now within this bone, we also have the sella turcica. The sella turcica, or Turkish saddle, what it does, it helps to protect a part of the endocrine system that is called the pituitary gland. So this is one of the key points there, that the sphenoid bone has the sella turcica, and this sella turcica helps to protect the pituitary gland, or contains the pituitary gland. Now here we have the temporal bone, the internal view. Things that you can see will be the internal acoustic meatus, which is a connection that allows the passage of the sound waves from the or the signals that are produced by the sound waves from the middle ear into the into the inner ear, and then into the area of our brain that helps to make us hear. In the internal view of the occipital bone, this one, the most posterior and inferior bone of our skull, we have different markings. So we have this big hole that is called the foramen magnum, and then we have these tiny holes that are called the hypoglossal canal. This hypoglossal canal helps for the passage of cranial nerve number 12, which is called the hypoglossal, which is the cranial nerve that allows us to move our tongue so we can speak. Now, in between the temporal bone and the occipital bone, we have a foramen that is called the jugular foramen. The jugular vein passes here through this foramen. Now, the right temporal bone is shown in here. So let's look at some of the features. So the temporal bone in this lateral surface, which is this bone that you can see here, it's the most inferior lateral bone of our skull, has this part that is called the squama or squamous part. And this edge will be forming the squamous suture, the connection between the parietal and the temporal bone, which is this. And then it has posterior to the squama or squamous part, this mastoid part where we have the mastoid process. If you want to feel your mastoid process, just put your fingers behind your ear, and that strong bone that you feel, this strong part of the bone will be the mastoid process. And then within the mastoid process above, we have the mastoid notch, and more internally and inferiorly within the temporal bone, we have the styloid process or needle-like process. And then superior to this styloid process, we have the external acoustic meatus or ear canal, and more superior to this external acoustic meatus, we have this horizontal projection that is called the zygomatic process. And just below the posterior portion of the zygomatic process, we have the mandibular fossa. And this part below the external acoustic meatus or ear canal and the mandibular fossa, we have the tympanic part of the temporal bone. Now, this temporal bone helps to protect the senses of hearing and equilibrium or balance. So if someone has damage to this temporal bone, like if it's receiving an injury, a hit within this area, the person will have affected the hearing and the balance. This is another key point. Now, internally in the middle surface of the temporal bone, you can see the squamous suture, the zygomatic process in here, the squamous part, the internal acoustic meatus, which is continuous with the external acoustic meatus, and then we have the mastoid process, which is filled with air cells. So it's like if it was a sinus, similar to a sinus, because you have this cavity filled inside the mastoid process filled with air. And then you can see here the styloid process. Middle ear infections that are complicated, they tend to go from the middle ear here into the mastoid process. And this inflammation and infection of the mastoid process is called mastoiditis, and you need to perform surgery to drain the pus created by the bacteria. Now, this is the inferior view of the skull. So in the inferior view of the skull, you can see different bones. You can see the petrous part of the temporal bone, which is this. And then you can see the vomer, which is one bone that helps to divide the nasal cavity into right and left. Also, you can see here the other parts of the temporal bone, which is the mastoid process and the jugular foramen, and this structure in here anterior to the jugular foramen that is called the carotid canal. So the carotid artery, the internal carotid artery, passes through this carotid canal, and the jugular foramen allows the exit of the jugular vein. And then this region of the occipital bone, the one in green, that it is in close contact with the mid portion of the sphenoid, which is this one in blue, is called the basilar part of the occipital bone. And in here in the sphenoid, you can see these two projections, the medial and the lateral pterygoid plates. And here you can see the zygomatic arch, which is formed in part by the temporal bone through the zygomatic process, and then the zygomatic bone, which is our cheekbone. And then you can see here part of the parietal bone on the sides of the temporal bone of the occipital bone. And then in the occipital bone, you can see also the foramen magnum, the hypoglossal canal, and on the sides of the foramen magnum, you can see these processes, these condyles that are called the occipital condyles. These occipital condyles connect to the first cervical vertebrae that is called the atlas. And then you can see as well this inferior nuchal line and the superior nuchal line that helps to connect muscles and ligaments within the neck. And then this huge projection that is called the external occipital protuberance that you can feel on the most posterior and inferior part of your skull. If someone falls down in its back and it hits the head, this is the most prominent part which someone will hit, the external occipital protuberance, and it hurts so bad. So again, this is just to show you the internal view that corresponds to the similar part of the bones that you see before. Now the sphenoid, the keystone bone. So it has a bat shape with extended wings, which will be these ones that you see. This is the posterior view. And these wings will be called the greater wings. And then in here superiorly, you have the lesser wings that you can see here in the superior view. So these are the lesser wings. These will be the greater wings. Now within the greater wings, you have some foramina, like this round foramen that is called foramen ovale. And then you have anteriorly and medially within the greater wings this other foramen that is called foramen rotundum. And then laterally and inferiorly, or it's lateral and it's a little bit posterior to the foramen ovale, we have the foramen spinosum. So one way to learn how is the distribution from anterior to posterior of these foramina within the greater wings of the sphenoid will be ROS. So foramen rotundum, ovale, and spinosum. And then in here we have the sella turcica. And within the sella turcica we have the hypophyseal fossa, which is the actual one that holds the pituitary gland. And then here we have this optic canal and these anterior clinar processes. And in the posterior view, you can see the body of the sphenoid, which is here. Inside the body of the sphenoid, we have the sphenoid sinuses. And then we have here the lesser wings, the greater wings with the foramen ovale, the rotundum, and spinosum. And then in here we have the pterygoid processes. The one that are closer to the midline will be the medial pterygoid plates. And then here we have the lateral pterygoid plates that will be kind of the legs of the bat. So this is what you can see the comparison for the posterior view, and in here this is the superior view, so you don't get lost. So in the median section of the skull, or the mid-sagittal cut, you can see the sphenoidal sinus that is located in the body of the sphenoid. So we already talked about this, and one part that it is located in the skull, in the base, in between the sphenoid, which is this bone in blue, the temporal, which is this bone in purple, and the occipital, which is this bone in green, we have this ragged edge that is called the foramen lacerum. The ethmoid, it is this bone that it is located inferior to the frontal bone and superior to the vomer. So this has a shape like if it was like a T, and this mid part that forms the vertical part of the T letter will be called the perpendicular plate. And then on the sides of the perpendicular plates, we have the orbital plates, where you have these tiny spaces that are filled with air that are called the ethmoidal cells. Sometimes they call it ethmoidal sinuses, but these are more properly cells because they are smaller than a sinus. And then this will be the cribriform foramina, the area where the nerves from our nose passes in through our brain. And in here, this projection of the perpendicular plate will be called the crista galli. And all of these here will be the cribriform plate. Now, for the orbit, we have different bones that makes up the orbit. So the roof of the orbit is made by the orbital plate of the frontal bone, which is this part, and the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone, which is this part. And then here we have the optic canal. So the optic nerve, the nerve that makes us see, guys, passes through here. Now the medial wall of the orbit, which is this, will be made by the orbital plate of the ethmoid bone, which we see before, this one, this part in green, and then the lacrimal bone, which is a tiny bone in the orbit, that is this one in red, and by a part of the facial bone, that is one of the facial bones, which will be the maxilla. So this is the maxilla, and this part will be called the frontal process of the maxilla. Why is it called the frontal process? Well, because it connects to the frontal bone in here. Now, the floor of the orbit is made by the orbital process of the palatine bone, which is a bone that can be seen better in the inferior view of the skull, and we will see in just a few slides. So this is the orbital process of the palatine bone, and also this floor of the orbit is made by the orbital surface of the maxilla, which is this bone in brown, light brown color. And then the lateral wall of the orbit, which is kind of the most prominent part, it will be made by the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, which is this part, the zygomatic bone, which is the cheekbone, this one in teal color, and this part will be the orbital surface of the zygomatic bone, and also it will be made by the greater wing of the sphenoid, and in between the greater wing of the sphenoid, the lesser wing of the sphenoid, the orbital process of the palatine, the orbital surface of the maxilla, and the zygomatic with its orbital surface, we have this slit or irregular foramen that is called the inferior orbital fissure. So several cranial nerves passes through this fissure. And as well, we have another one that is not shown in here, that is called this, it's here. So this is the inferior orbital fissure, and here we have the superior orbital fissure. So some of the structures that passes through the superior orbital fissure will be the lacrimal nerve, which is a branch of a nerve that is called the ophthalmic nerve. Also the frontal nerve, that it is a branch of the ophthalmic nerve as well. The trochlear nerve as well passes into here. And also cranial nerve number 3, or oculomotor, that help us to move our eyes to the sides, up and down, etc. And also we have another branch of the ophthalmic nerve that is called the nasociliary branch, that helps to innervate or provide function to part of this muscle that we have within our eyes. And also we have the abducens nerve, or cranial nerve number 6, that help us to move our eyes laterally. And also another structure that passes through there is the ophthalmic vein and the sympathetic fibers. So again, this is another view of the skull, and then you can see better in this part the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid, which is this, separating the nasal cavity from right and left, together with the vomer, which is this facial bone that we have in here. And you can see the palatine bone here in our median view as well, forming the hard palate together with this palatine process of the maxilla. So within the nasal cavity, we have several bones. We have the upper bone that is called the ethmoid, this one in green, and it has two projections that are called the superior and middle nasal conchae. This nasal conchae helps to increase the speed for the air to travel from the floor of the nasal cavity, which is this, going into the roof of the nasal cavity, which is this, where we have the nerves to allow us to smell. So the superior middle nasal conchae are part of the ethmoid bone. Now within the nasal cavity, we have another conchae that is called inferior nasal conchae. This is a bone that it is just a bone of itself, and it's not part of the ethmoid. Now in the anterior part of our nose or nasal cavity, you have nasal cartilages that provides this shape to our nose, and in the bridge of our nose, in the root of our nose, we have the nasal bones, which are two tiny bones that can be easily fractured. Now the facial bones are 14 bones that makes up the face of the skull, namely the orbits, the nasal cavities, and the jaw. So we have two nasal bones, we have two lacrimal bones, we have two zygomatics, we have a vomer, we have two palatine bones, two inferior nasal conchae, two maxilla, and the mandible. Functions of the facial bones will be to support our teeth, give shape to our face, form part of the orbit and the nasal cavities, and provides attachment for the muscles of facial expression. Not all of them, but some of them, and also for the muscles of mastication, which are the muscles that we use to chew. So the most prominent and superior and medial bone of our face will be the maxilla. So the maxilla connects medially and superiorly to the nasal bones, which are these two in here. And the maxilla forms the lateral portion of the nasal cavity, which will be this one in here. And then in here we have the vomer, that is part of these facial bones, that together with the ethmoid, which is part of the skull bones, will separate the nasal cavity. So they will form what we call the bony septum. Septum means wall. So then this nasal septum, the bony nasal septum, separates the nasal cavity into right and left. And then in here we have the nasal conchae, the middle at least, the one that you can see here. And then in here you have the inferior nasal conchae. Now the maxilla has the infraorbital foramen just below the inferior margin of the orbit, which will be this. And it has this intermaxillary suture just below the mid portion of the nasal cavity. And the maxillary also has these processes or these sockets that are called the alveolus, which helps to hold our teeth on our superior arc of our teeth. Now another bone that you can see here in the anterior view of the facial bones will be the lacrimal bones, these ones in red. They are very, very internal within the orbit, and they have a canal that helps for the tears that are produced by the lacrimal gland to flow from the orbit into our nose, into our nasal cavity, going just below to the inferior nasal conchae. Another bone that you can see of the face in here will be the mandible. The mandible has this mental protuberance, which is a projection that fuses and forms part of this most anterior region of this facial bone. Also, we have here the mandibular symphysis, which is the point of fusion between the right and the left mandible before they convert into a single bone. And then on the sides of this mental protuberance, we have the mental foramen, which allows the passage of a nerve that helps us to feel sensation in our lip area and also in the gingiva within this area, which is a mucosa that protects our oral cavity. Now this part of the mandible will be the mandibular body, and the mandible, similar as to the maxilla, has alveolar processes or alveolus, which helps to hold our teeth into its place. Now this is the zygomatic bone, which has a maxillary process and it has a frontal process, and this will be our cheekbone. This is the inferior view of the maxilla. So you can see this suture that is called the intermaxillary suture that joins these processes on the sides of this maxilla in the inferior view. This will be the palatine processes of the maxilla. And then just posterior to these teeth that we have in here that are called the incisors, we will have a fossa that is called the incisive fossa. Now the maxilla connects to the palatine bones, and these palatine bones have the maxillary processes, and they will form together what we call the hard palate, and then this will be called the mid-palatine suture. So this is the palatine bone, and then in here you have the greater palatine foramen, and there's another one that is called the small palatine foramen, but you cannot see it. And as I said before, they form the hard palate, and this will be the alveolar processes of the maxilla. Inside the maxilla, we have these sinuses that are called the maxillary sinuses. These are the largest sinuses, and they are larger than the frontal, the sphenoid, and the ethmoidal sinuses. We already saw this, but this is just to show you the hard palate formed by the maxilla and the palatine bones. And this, it's part of our alveolar processes. So this is the view of the lacrimal bones, the lateral view. So it's not marking here, but we have a lacrimal fossa. And then this is the zygomatic bone, which is our cheekbone. And this foramen in here is called the zygomaticofacial foramen. And this will be the temporal process of the of the zygomatic bone, and then this will be the zygomatic process of the temporal bone forming the zygomatic arc or arch. So this then it's another repetition, is just for you to show you the small facial bones, which is the lacrimal bones and the nasal bones. And of course, this is the medial view of the nasal bones in here. So the mandible. This is the only bone in our skull that it is not connected through sutures or immovable joints or articulations. This mandible connects to the temporal bone at the mandibular fossa by these rounded projections that are called the mandibular condyles. So as we move the jaw or the mandible up and down, you have free movement. We need to speak, we need to also eat. So that's why we have movable joint in here in the mandible. Why don't we have movable joints within the skull in adults? Well, it's because we need to protect our brain. So that's why we have sutures or immovable joints within the skull, but not within the mandible. Now this then will be the lateral view of the mandible and also the medial view of the mandible in here. So you can see the mandibular condyles that are protected by a pair of cartilage, and this will be the mandibular notch. And then anterior to the mandibular notch, we have the cornoid process, which is this. And then this angulated portion of the mandible is called the ramus. This will be the angle, which you can feel if you touch the lower and posterior portion of our jaw. And then this will be the body. And then in here we have the mandibular symphysis with the mental protuberance. And then in here will be the mental foramen. This will be the alveolar processes that holds our teeth. And then inside the ramus, we have this mandibular foramen. And then we have this area that helps to hold a gland that is called the submandibular gland. The hyoid bone is this anterior neck bone that it is only held into the neck by ligaments and muscles. Like this is the stylohyoid muscle that holds this bone into the styloid process of the temporal bone. Now this bone has a portion that is anterior, it's called the body, and then it has these lesser horns that faces superiorly, and then it has these projections posteriorly that are called the greater horns. This bone has a U shape or horseshoe shape, and it's very fragile. It can break really easily, and it's located superiorly to the larynx. For the auditory ossicles, we have these bones, the stapes here, and then we have the incus and the malleus. They're very tiny. They are even tinier than a penny. Now within baby's skull, you have spaces that are not fused and not fused cranial bones, and they contain a fibrous membrane. The function of these fontanelles is to allow the movement of the bones as the baby is born through the birth canal, and also allows for the expansion of the brain as the brain is developing. Now, these fontanelles are named accordingly. So we have one that is located between the frontal bones and the parietal bones that is called the anterior. And then we have the sphenoid that is called anterolateral, and this one will be in between the greater wing of the sphenoid that you can see laterally and also in between the temporal bone. Now the posterior one will be located between the parietal bones and the occipital bones. And the mastoid or posterolateral fontanelles will be at the level of the mastoid process within the temporal bone. Now, the two frontal bones will fuse by the age of 6, and they will form what we call the metatarsic suture. And by the age of 8 or 9, the skull will approach its adult size. So this is the sutures then that we have. The fontanelles that we have. This will be the anterior fontanelle between the frontal bone, this is the superior view, and the temporal bone. Then here we have the sphenoid fontanelle between the sphenoid bone and the temporal. And then we have here the posterior fontanelle that you can see here between the occipital and the parietal bones, and then these will be the mastoid fontanelles. And they have different age at which they disappear, but the one that takes the longest to disappear will be the anterior. Now let's talk about the vertebral column. So the vertebral column is made out of 33 vertebrae, and the functions of the spine will be to support the skull, the trunk, and allows for the movement of these, and also helps to protect the part of the central nervous system that is called the spinal cord, helps to absorb stresses of the movements, and helps also to provide an attachment point for our limbs, the thoracic cage, and for muscles that influence posture. Now, in between some vertebrae, we have a structure that is called the intervertebral disc. And this intervertebral disc accounts for about 1/4 of the spine's length, so 71 centimeters on average. The disc will compress a bit during the day due to pressure of the body weight. The vertebrae are distributed into 5 groups. We have 7 cervical vertebrae in the neck, 12 thoracic vertebrae in the chest, 5 lumbar in the lower back, 5 fused vertebrae at the base of the spine, forming the sacrum, and also we have 4 coccygeal vertebrae that forms the coccyx. There are some variations in number, anatomical variations that can occur in 1 in 20 people, but generally in the number of fused vertebrae, they are located in the inferior part, not in the separated vertebrae. So we have within the vertebrae primary curvatures that forms during fetal development. And these primary curvatures will be these ones that forms like a continuous C shape, and they are convex. So these are curvatures that if they persist, they will form the thoracic and part of the when they persist, these will persist and they will form part of the thoracic vertebrae or thoracic spine or curvature and the pelvic curvature. Now the secondary curvatures develop after we're born. The first one that we develop, it will be the cervical, and these will develop as we start lifting our head up, and then we will have the lumbar, which it develops once we start walking. Now these opposite to the primary curvatures, they are concave. The primary curvatures are convex while these ones are concave, and all of these together, the primary and the secondary, will form an S-shaped vertebral column in the mid-sagittal view with these 4 normal curvatures: the cervical, thoracic, the lumbar, and the pelvic. So this is the figure showing you the vertebral column. So you have 7 cervical vertebrae. The first cervical vertebrae will be called the atlas, or C1. The second cervical vertebrae will be called the axis, or C2. And then the rest will be just numbered vertebrae. Will be C3, C4, C5, C6, and C7. Now we have another name for C7. This is the posterior view. This is the anterior view. It's called the vertebra prominens. And then below the cervical vertebrae, we have 12 thoracic vertebrae, T1, T2, T3, T4, etc., up to T12. These will be located exclusively at the thoracic area, and they connect to the ribs. Now in the lower back, we have the lumbar vertebrae, and these lumbar vertebrae are 5, L1 through L5, and they are the strongest vertebrae, the single vertebrae that we have. So in between the cervical and the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae, we have this disc that we already talked about. And then we have the 5 fused sacral vertebrae that are named S1 through S5, and then we have the coccygeals that are 4 fused vertebrae. So this is the spinal curvatures of the newborn. This will be the thoracic. And then you can see it here in the adult. So this one, the cervical, is secondary. Why? Because we develop as we are lifting our head. And then this will be the lumbar, the one that we develop as we start walking. Now, if you have an exaggerated convexity of your thoracic or curvature, this will be called kyphosis. So it's an exaggeration of this forward curvature. And this can be due to compression of the vertebrae due to fractures when someone has osteoporosis or end plate and disc degeneration. Now, lordosis will be exaggeration of the lumbar curvature. This is when someone has excess of abdominal fat or if a female is pregnant. So some of these abnormalities can develop when someone has a disease. For instance, if someone has paralysis of the trunk muscles, if he has poor posture. I already talked about pregnancy, or sometimes some people can have congenital defects. Scoliosis, it's a sideways curvature. It is the most common abnormal spinal curvature that exists, and it is more prominent in the thoracic region, particularly of adults and girls. This it's a developmental abnormality in which the arc fails to develop on one side of the vertebrae. And another name for kyphosis will be hunchback. It can also happen when someone wrestles or weight lifts. And lordosis, another name will be swayback. So this is the view of the abnormal spinal curvature. So in green, it's supposed to be normal, mid-alignment of the spine. And this lateral curvature is known as scoliosis. This is kyphosis or hunchback, and this is lordosis or swayback. General vertebrae have different structures. So we have a body or centrum, which helps to carry the weight. So it's the weight bearing portion. So this is another key point that we have. So the portion of the general vertebrae that helps to carry the weight will be the disc. Sorry, the centrum or body. So let me make a pause in here. So let me tell you the key points for this chapter together. So the first key point will be what will be the recommended treatment for osteoporosis: the intake of vitamin C, vitamin D, calcium supplement, and the intake of dairy products. The other key point, the second key point, will be that the hypophyseal fossa of the sella turcica of the sphenoid bone contains the pituitary gland. The third key point is that damage to the temporal bone will most likely affect the senses of balance and hearing. The next key point is when someone dislocates his jaw, the injury involves the condylar process of the mandible. So again, when someone has a dislocated jaw, the injury involves the dislocation of the condylar process of the mandible. The next key point it will be that the role of the sinuses includes making the skull lighter to produce mucus that moistens our air, so we cannot have dry air coming into our skull. And then the next key point is that the part of the vertebrae that transfers weight along the axis of the vertebral column will be the vertebral body. So all of these are the key points for this chapter. Now another part of the general vertebrae will be the vertebral foramina. So this vertebral foramina forms a vertebral canal through which the spinal cord passes. And then the vertebral arc will be made by a couple of structures that are called the pedicle, that it's a pillar-like structure, and a plate-like structure is called the lamina. And then the spinous processes will be projections that forms an arc, and these will be the bumps that you can feel when you touch your vertebrae. So these are the structures of the representative vertebrae. This will be the body or centrum, the ones that carry the weight. And then here we have the vertebral foramen through which the spinal cord passes. This will be the transverse process, and this will be the spinous process. So this is the posterior area, this will be the anterior area, and this will be the sides. And this will be the pedicle, and this will be the lamina, forming the vertebral arch. And in here you can see the superior articular fossa, and in the inferior view you can see the inferior articular fossa. So the transverse processes are lateral extensions from where the pedicel or the pedicle and the lamina meet. The superior articular processes are upward projections that helps to connect to the superior adjacent vertebrae or the superior neighboring vertebrae. And it will meet the inferior articular process from the vertebrae above to make this joint. The facets will be flat surfaces that are covered with hyaline cartilage that allows the joint or bone-to-bone connection. The intervertebral foramen will be lateral foramens that you can see in the lateral view that helps for the passageway of the spinal nerves as they're exiting the spinal cord. And the inferior vertebral notch in the pedicle of the upper vertebrae and the superior vertebral notch in the pedicle of the lower vertebrae will form the intervertebral foramen. So this is two articular vertebrae, L2 and L3. So this is the posterior view. So this will be the spinous processes, this will be the lamina, this will be the transverse processes. And then in here you have the superior articular process and inferior articular process of L2. So the inferior articular process of L2 connects to the superior articular process of L3. And in these processes, as you can see here, we have this articular fossa with this pad of cartilage. This gray portion that you see here will be the articular cartilage. And in between the adjacent vertebrae here you can see it better in the lateral view. In between the vertebrae, you have this disc that is called the intervertebral disc. So these thick portions of the vertebrae will be the body. And then you have the spinous process here. In the lateral view, this will be the transverse process. And then here will be the superior and inferior articular process of L1, superior and inferior articular process of L2, and superior and inferior articular process of L3. And in between these areas, in the inferior, you have the inferior vertebral notch and superior vertebral notch of L1 and L2. So you form an intervertebral foramen. So these will be vertebral notches, superior and inferior vertebral notches. So you form an intervertebral foramen. So the nerves from our spine, a spinal cord, exits through here, through the intervertebral foramen. So how many intervertebral discs do we have? 23. And they have a center that is called the nucleus pulposus, that is filled with jelly-like tissue that is called the inner gelatinous mass. And then surrounding this nucleus pulposus, we have the ring of fibrocartilage that is called the annulus fibrosus. This intervertebral disc protects the body of the vertebrae and helps to support the weight and absorb shock. When we age, these intervertebral discs become dehydrated, so they lose water. And the annulus fibrosus become fragile and it can break. This will allow the herniation of a disc, which will be a rupture in the annulus fibrosus, and the nucleus pulposus exits and it can compress a spinal nerve, causing severe pain. Now, this not only can happen as we age, but also if someone is young and is carrying a heavy object, it can rupture one of its intervertebral discs, or if someone is overweight, no matter if it's young, it can rupture one of these discs. So this is how the intervertebral disc, so this is the superior view of a normal disc. So you have this center, which is called the nucleus pulposus, filled with jelly-like tissue. And this will be the annulus fibrosus. This is the fibrocartilage. And then if you rupture this annulus fibrosus, you have the nucleus pulposus exiting, compressing these nerves that exit through the intervertebral foramen. So this will be a herniated disc. What are some of the regional characteristics of the vertebrae? So cervical vertebrae are the smallest and lightest vertebrae that we have. They have a spinous process that is bifid or bifurcated, so it splits kind into two. Not in all the cases, but usually between C2 through C6. And they have a small body with a large vertebral foramen that it is usually kind of triangular. The transverse foramen, it has a short the cervical vertebrae has a transverse foramen within the transverse process, which is short and allows the passage of the vertebral artery and the vertebral vein. Special names for cervical vertebrae: C1, which is atlas, C2 for axis, and C7 for vertebral prominence, because it has the most pronounced spinous process. So this is how the cervical vertebrae look like: small body, triangular vertebral foramen, split spinous process, and short transverse process with a hole that is called the transverse foramen. This is the lateral view. So you have here the inferior articular process, superior articular process. And then this will be the spinous process, the body. Characteristics of the atlas, or C1. Atlas is in direct connection to support the head. The Greek mythology Atlas person, it used to hold the world in its shoulders. So that's how whoever described this vertebrae for the first time thought about the atlas, and they put the name to Atlas, because I think it imagined that our head is our world. But anyway, so this is the only vertebrae in our body that it doesn't have a body. And it has a delicate ring around the large vertebral foramen, and instead of a body has lateral masses. And these lateral masses have superior articular fauces that articulate with the occipital condyles, so you can nod, so you can say yes. And this will form the atlanto-occipital joint because it's the connection between the atlas and the occipital bone. And then inferiorly, the lateral masses have the inferior articular fauces that articulate with C2 or the axis, so they form the atlanto-axial joint. And with the atlanto-axial joint, you can move your head to the sides like saying no. And then anteriorly, these atlas have an arch and posteriorly has an arch. So these will be the anterior and posterior arches that ends in a tubercle, the anterior and posterior tubercles. So this is the superior view of the atlas. So this will be the large vertebral foramen. This will be the anterior arch, which is shorter than the posterior arch. This will be the transverse processes, and it doesn't have a body, but it has these lateral masses. These lateral masses have the superior articular faucet that is actually concave. This concavity helps to complement the convexity of the occipital condyle, so you can nod, forming the atlanto-axial joint. The axis, or C2, it's a tiny vertebrae, but it's very important because in its superior part of the body has a projection, a pointed projection that is called the dens or odontoid process. This odontoid process articulates with the atlas, forming the atlanto-axial joint. And it is held by ligaments into the atlas so that you can rotate your head saying no, and this axis fuses by H3 to 6, and it will project into the vertebral foramen of the atlas. It's held in place by the transverse ligament. Now, when this axis breaks during a whiplash accident, or when someone falls and hits his head, this axis can break and go into the spinal cord, and then the person can become paralyzed, just like what happened to Christopher Reeve, the actor. So this is the superior view of the axis. So this is the body. The upper projection of the body, the pointed projection, will be the dens or odontoid process. This will be the pedicle. This will be the lamina. This will be the vertebral arch. And this will be the spinous process, the trans process with the transforamina, and the superior articular faucet. So this is the atlanto-axial joint. So this will be the transverse ligament. So this will be the articular faucet for the dens or the odontoid process of the atlas. So this is the anterior arch of the atlas, and this will be the posterior arch of the atlas. So you can rotate with the axis or dens and say no. So characteristics of the thoracic vertebrae. We have 12, numbered T1 through T12, and these correspond to the 12 pairs of ribs that attach to them. We have a spinous process that is pointed and is angulated, that points sharply downward, and it has a larger body than the cervical. So as we move in the vertebrae from superior to inferior, so from cervical to thoracic and then into lumbar, you increase the size of the body because you are carrying more weight as you go down with the vertebrae. So this has a medium-sized body. And you have facets for articulating with the ribs. So you have an anterior and inferior costal facets. And the body is small, smooth, with slightly concave spots. Now the transverse costal facets will be located in transverse process between vertebrae T1 through T10. And this will provide a second point of articulations for ribs T1 through T10. So this is how the thoracic vertebrae looks like. So in the left you can see the superior view. So this will be the body. This will be the vertebral foramen. The body is medium size. The vertebral foramen is triangular at some point. It has this transverse process with transverse costal facets between T1 through T10. And then in here we have the lamina, the pedicle, forming the vertebral arch. This will be the spinous process. Like if you can see in the lateral view, it is angulated, pointing sharply downward. And then in here on the body, in the posterior region next to the pedicle, you have the superior and inferior costal facets. So we have within the ribs or the costal bones a head that articulates with the body of the vertebrae, the thoracic vertebrae, in the superior inferior costal facet. And then we have the transverse costal facet that articulates with the costal tubercle of the ribs. For the lumbar vertebrae, the characteristic, we have 5. These have the most massive body, so the body is thick and stout, and it has a short, blunt, squarish-like spinous process, and it has also short transverse process, and the superior articular processes will face medially because the lumbar region is resistant to twisting movements. So this is the superior view of the lumbar vertebrae. So this is the body. This is the transverse process, which are short. This will be the spinous process, which is short as well. So if you see it here in the lateral view, it's short and it ends in the blunt end. And then it has the superior and inferior articular processes, and it has the most prominent vertebral notch. Why is this? Well, because the larger nerves that are going to innervate our legs the largest spinal nerves exit through these intervertebral notches. The sacrum, 5 fused sacral vertebrae, S1 through S5. They begin fusing around age 16, and they complete the fusion by age 26. So some of you still don't have fused your sacral vertebrae because you are less than 26. And in the anterior surface, you have a smooth concave portion, and then you have transverse line that runs side to side that indicate the regions of fusion of your sacral vertebrae. And then you have 4 large anterior sacral foramina that allows the passage of the sacral nerves and arteries to the pelvic organs. And then you have in the first sacral vertebrae a prominent portion that is called the sacral promontory. In the posterior surface, which is rough, you have a line that is called the median sacral crest that runs from superior to inferior, which represents the fusion of the spinous processes. And then on the sides of the median sacral crest, you have the fusion of the transverse processes, and this will be called the lateral sacral crest. Now, in between the median and the lateral sacral crest, you have the posterior sacral foramina, which is basically the same as the anterior sacral foramina, and this will allow the passage of nerves that goes to the gluteal region and to the lower nerves. And then within the sacrum, you have a canal and a hiatus. The canal is the superior opening that runs vertically and ends in the last sacral vertebrae, S5, and also goes a little bit into the coccyx, and this will be called the sacral hiatus. This will contain spinal nerve roots, and on the sides of the sacrum, you have a roughened surface that is called the auricular surface that connects to the iliac bone in the pelvic bone or the coxal bone, forming the sacroiliac joint or SI joint. Now, the superior articular processes on S1 will articulate with the inferior articular processes of L5. And then in the anterior surface of this sacrum, you have the ala, which are pair large wing-like extensions lateral to the superior articular processes. Coccyx has four small vertebrae, CO1 to CO4. Don't confuse C for cervical with CO. CO stands for coccyx. So it will be coccygeal 1 vertebrae for CO1, and CO4 will be the fourth coccygeal vertebrae. Sometimes some people can have 5. This is the anatomical variations that we talked to you about. And then these coccygeal, they fuse into single bone that is triangular by the age of 20, but it can go up to 30. And then on CO1, you have little projections that are called the horns or cornua. This will allow for the attachment of ligaments that will bind the sacrum to the coccyx. And sometimes this coccyx can be fractured during birth of babies. So during difficult childbirth, the females will break the coccyx, or if someone has a heart fall. And it's a bone that it provides attachment for several muscles of the pelvic floor. So this is the anterior and posterior view of the sacrum and the coccyx. So this will be S1, S2 through S5. This will be the transverse lines. This will be the anterior sacral foramina. This will be the ala. This will be the sacral promontory, and this will be the superior articular process that connects to the L5, inferior articular processes. And then this hole that you see here in between the superior articular processes will be the sacral canal that connects here with the sacral hiatus. And this will be the lateral sacral crest, and this will be the median sacral crest, and this will be the posterior sacral foramina. This is the coccyx, CO1 through CO4 in the anterior and the posterior view, and CO1 has these little projections, upward projections, that are called the cornua. Okay, for the thoracic cage, it consists of the thoracic vertebrae, the sternum, and the ribs. It will help to protect the lungs and the heart, and also some protection to abdominal organs like the spleen, the liver, and the kidneys. It will also help to provide attachment for the pectoral girdle and the upper limbs, and it has a broad base and a narrow apex. When we rhythmically move the thoracic cage, we allow the expansion of this thoracic cage so we can breathe, and it will maintain life. Now, within the thoracic cage, we have the costal margin, which is the inferior border of the thoracic cage that forms an arc of the lower ribs. The ribs are connected to the sternum. Sternum is known as the breastbone as well, and this sternum helps to protect part of the heart. It will divide into 3 major regions: the upper region, which will be called the manubrium, and in the manubrium you have a notch that you can feel at the bottom of your neck anteriorly, that is called the suprasternal or jugular notch. And then on the sides of the manubrium you have the clavicular notches that helps to form a connection with the clavicle. And it has a body that is called the gladiolus, and this will be the longest part of the sternum, just below the manubrium, and it will connect to ribs by scallop lateral margins. Now, the connection between the manubrium and the body helps to provide a point where the body joins the manubrium, which is called the sternal angle, and it happens at the level of the second intercostal space, which are spaces in between the ribs. Now, the xiphoid process will be the most inferior region of the sternum, and it will be the point of attachment for some abdominal muscles. If someone provides CPR, sometimes the pressure is so high that it can compress the xiphoid process and it can produce an internal bleeding. Now the ribs are 12 pairs, so they have this posterior part that is called the proximal part that attaches to the vertebral column. It has a head that connects to the body of the thoracic vertebrae, and it has an angle that has a tubercle that connects to the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. Now, most ribs have an anterior end from ribs 1 through 10, and part of these ribs attach to the sternum, directly or indirectly. Now, this connection happens by a costal cartilage that is made of hyaline cartilage. So this is the classification of the ribs. So ribs pair 1 through 7 are known as the true ribs. They are directly connected to the sternum by their own costal cartilage. False ribs will be pairs 8 through 12 because they don't have their own connection to the sternum, or they don't connect at all. So the last pair of ribs, the two pairs 11 and 12, they don't connect at all to the sternum. That's why they're called floating ribs. And ribs 8 through 10, they connect indirectly to the sternum using the costal cartilage of rib number 7. So that's why they're called false ribs. So this is how the ribs look like. So they have a posterior portion, that is the head. They have a neck, they have a tubercle, and they have the angle that allows them to curve anteriorly and inferiorly. And then these ribs 1 through 7 connect directly into the sternum using their own costal cartilage. So these will be the true ribs. Now pairs 8, 9, and 10, they are called false because they use the costal cartilage of rib number 7 to connect, and then ribs 11 and 12, they don't connect at all, so they are false and floating too. Now these are the parts of the sternum. This will be the manubrium, this will be the body, and this will be the xiphoid process. Within the manubrium you have this notch that is called the suprasternal notch, the most medial notch, and then you have this clavicular notch laterally of the manubrium, in the manubrium that connects to the clavicles. And then this will be the sternal angle that connects the manubrium to the body, and this will be the xiphoid process. And in between the body and the xiphoid process, you have the xiphi sternal joint. So again, the head of the ribs connects to the bodies of the thoracic vertebrae at the superior and inferior articular fossets. Then you have a narrow portion distal to the head that is called the neck. And then you have a tubercle that is a wider, rough area distal to the neck that articulates with the transverse costal fossa in the transverse process of the thoracic vertebrae. Remember, the only vertebrae where we have connections to the ribs will be the thoracic, not the cervical, not the lumbar. And then the angle will be a lateral curve on the rib that allows the rib to go a little bit anterior and inferior. And then we have the shaft, which will be the rest of the rib, that has a long, gently sloping, that looks like a blade. And inferiorly in the shaft, we have the costal groove that allows the passage of the intercostal nerves from lateral to medial. Will be a vein, an artery, and a nerve, like vein. So this is how the ribs look like. So this is the head, this is the neck, this is the tubercle, this will be the angle, and then this will be the shaft, and this is the inferior view, so this is the costal groove. And this is how the thoracic vertebrae connects to the ribs. So this is the head, connects to the costal facets. This is the tubercle that connects to the transverse process in the transverse costal facet. Okay, so that's all for the axial skeleton. Now let's talk about the appendicular skeleton. So we have the pectoral girdle, which is also known as the shoulder girdle, that helps to support the arm. It consists of the clavicle or collarbone and the scapula or shoulder blade. The clavicle articulates medially with the sternum and laterally to the scapula, forming the sternoclavicular joint and the acromioclavicular joint. The scapula will articulate with the clavicle and the humerus, and then it will form the glenohumeral joint when it connects to the humerus or shoulder joint. And this joint is easily dislocated because we have free movement of the arm, and then this connection is shallow. So this is the structures of the clavicle. So it has an italic S shape. This is our collarbone. This is the medial end. It's more vertical, the end, and it's called the sternal end because it connects medially to the sternum. And this will be the acromial end, which, if you can see, it is more concave, or sorry, convex. That's one way that you can distinguish. So this is the superior view. Now in the inferior view, you can see not only the sternal end and the acromial end, but you can see this conoid tubercle that allows for the articulation of some ligaments. The scapula, it's this wing blade or triangular bone. It's a flat bone that we have on the posterior part of our upper back. And then this is the anterior view on the left. This is the posterior view on the right. Now, some things that you can see in the anterior view. So you can see these borders. So you have the superior border, middle border, and lateral border that ends in these angles. This is the superior angle, inferior angle, and this will be the lateral angle that you can see as well in here on the posterior view. And then you have this lateral portion that has this cavity that's called the glenoid cavity. This glenoid cavity will connect to the humerus, to the head of the humerus. And then projecting here on the lateral view of, or the lateral side of the scapula, you have this coracoid process, and then you have the acromion, which you can see better here posteriorly. And then just inferior to the superior border, in between the medial border and the lateral border, you have this subscapular fossa that allows for the connection of different muscles. Now in the posterior view, you can see again superior angle, inferior angle, lateral angle, and then medial border, lateral border, and superior border. Now the scapula has posteriorly an angulated projection that you can feel really easily if you just cross your arm and touch your opposite scapula with your fingers, just going a little bit over your shoulder. So that projection that you feel there, that is so strong, that's the spine. And then the spine ends in this projection that is called the acromion. And then in the superior portion of the spine, you have the supraspinous fossa, and then in the inferior portion of the spine, you have the infraspinous fossa. These supra and infraspinous fossas allows for the connection of some muscles. And then in here in the lateral angle, you can see the glenoid cavity that again helps to connect the head of the humerus, which is this bone that you can see here, or arm bone. Now the upper limb, it has 4 regions, that it has a total of 30 bones per limb. The brachium will be the most upper part of the upper limb, which is called the arm proper, extends from the shoulder to the elbow, and it only has the humerus. Now the antebrachium or forearm extends from the elbow to the wrist. It has 2 bones, laterally the radius and medially the ulna. And then in our wrist, we have the carpal region, which has 8 small bones arranged into rows. And within our hands, we have two groups of bones. We have the metacarpals in the palm, and we have the phalanges in the fingers. So we have 5 metacarpals and 14 phalanges. So out of these, the phalanges and the metacarpals, they don't have a specific name. You just number them from lateral to medial, 1 through 5. And then the rest of the bones are very easy to learn because the names are not special as well for this. So this is the arm bone, this is the humerus. So this is the anterior view on the left, posterior view on the right. So in the posterior view, what you can see is the head, which is not very prominent, it's a rounded projection. And then just below the head, you have an anatomical neck, which is this. And then you have a surgical neck, which is this, a little bit lower than the anatomical neck. And then in the posterior view, you can see a couple of rounded projections between the head and the neck, between the head and the surgical neck, which will be the greater tubercle and the lesser tubercle. And in between these two tubercles, you have a groove that is called the intertubercular sulcus. Now, this will be the shaft of the humerus, and then a little bit above the middle of the shaft in the posterior view, you can see this deltoid tuberosity. This deltoid tuberosity allows for the attachment of the shoulder muscle, which is the deltoid. And then it's not labeling here, but you have the radial groove that runs along the shaft of the humerus that allows the passage of the radial nerve. Now, in the distal end, so this is the proximal end of the humerus where you have the head, and then the opposite end will be the distal end. In the distal end, in the posterior view, you can see this cornoid fossa in the medial part, and then on the side of the cornoid fossa, lateral side, will be the radial fossa. And then on the most lateral portion of the distal end of the humerus, you have in the posterior view the lateral condyle and the medial condyle in the medial part. And you can see also this line that is called the medial supracondylar ridge. And just below this radial and cornoid fossa, you have the trochlea. And then you have this rounded projection that is called the capitulum. Now, in the posterior view, sorry, this was the anterior view on the left, and then this will be the posterior view on the right. So in the posterior view on the right, you can see the greater tubercle, you can see some nutrient foramina, the deltoid tuberosity, and then you can see the olecranon fossa. The olecranon fossa, it's important to stop the forearm from bending into the arm greater than 90 degrees. And then you see the trochlea below the olecranon fossa, and then on the sides of the olecranon fossa you have the lateral epicondyle, the lateral supracondylar ridge, and then on the medial side and superior to the trochlea you have the medial supracondylar ridge and the medial epicondyle. For the radius and the ulna, the forearm bones. So the lateral bone will be the radius, the middle bone will be the ulna. So you have the proximal and the distal ends that you can see here. Now in the proximal end, the radius has the radial notch of, has the radial head or the head of the radius, it has a neck, and it has the radial tuberosity. And then you have the shaft that connects to the shaft of the ulna by this interosseous membrane. And then in the proximal part of the ulna, you have the olecranon, which is our elbow bone, and then you have the trochlear notch, and then you have the cornoid process. And then you have the ulna, the ulna connecting to the radius at the radial notch of the ulna. And then you have the ulnar tuberosity just here. And then this is the posterior view of the radius of the ulna. So this is the olecranon process, head of the radius, the neck, the tuberosity, and the radial notch of the ulna. This is the shaft of both, the interosseous membrane in here, and then distally, in the anterior view of the radius, you have the styloid process and the articular facets of the styloid process, and then you have here the head of the ulna, and then the styloid process in here. And it's the same structures for the posterior view, and you have the ulnar notch of the radius. Within the wrist, we have 8 bones that allows movements of flexion, extension, abduction, and adduction, so you can move freely your wrist, so you can move your hand. And then you have 2 rows of 4 bones each for the carpal bones. So the proximal row has these bones with the following name: scaphoid, lunate, triquetum, and pisiform. And then the distal row has trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. Pisiform is actually a sesamoid bone that developed by the age of 9 to 12 in the tendon of the flexor carpi ulnaris muscle. And then just because of this, because you are knowing the name of this muscle, which is called flexor, it helps to flex, carpi helps to flex the wrist, and is located on the ulnar side. So that will be the middle side. So this naming of these bones of the carpi will be from lateral to medial. So it will be scaphoid, lunate, triquetum, pisiform. So the most lateral will be scaphoid, the most medial will be the pisiform. And then trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate will be from lateral. The most lateral will be the trapezium, the most medial will be the hamate. So this is how the carpal bones look like. So this is the anterior view of the right hand. So this will be the proximal row of carpal bones. This will be the distal row. Proximal row is in yellow, distal row is in green. So it will be scaphoid, this one in here, and then this lunate, and then this triquetum, and this pisiform. So one mnemotechnic to learn the proximal row names will be Sally left the party. So Sally for scaphoid, left for lunate, the for triquetum, party for pisiform. And then for the distal row, trapezoid, trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate. So it will be to take Carmen home. 2 will be for trapezium, take for trapezoid, Carmen for capitate, and home for hamate. And hamate has a little hook that is called the hamulus of the hamate. Now this will be the metacarpal bones, and they don't have a special name, they just are metacarpals, but they have a base that connects to the carpal bones, the distal row. They have a body, which is the mid part, the bulk of our metacarpal bones, which form the palm, and they have the head that forms the knuckles. And then for naming, not only the metacarpals, but also for the phalanges, you use Roman numerals. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, not Arabic numerals, just the Roman numerals. Now for the metacarpals, they articulate with the phalanges. So we have 3 rows of phalanges. We have the proximal row, we have the medial row or middle, and then we have the distal row. Now from fingers 4 through 5, you have proximal, middle, and distal phalanges. But for the pollex, our thumb, we only have proximal and distal, so we don't have middle phalange. So that's it for those. It's very easy to learn. So the metacarpal bones form the palm. Metacarpal 1 forms a connection to the base of the thumb. And then metacarpal 5th will form a proximal to base of the little finger. And the phalanges, the names will be according to the row: proximal, middle, and distal. So thumb or pollex has proximal and distal. The rest have proximal, middle, and distal phalange. And we already saw that. Now for the pelvic girdle, it is one single bone that is called coxal or ossa coccyx or innominate. And this one develops first as 3 separate bones that ultimately fuse. So the more proper name to say for the hip bones would be coxal. And then the coxal bone will form part of the pelvic girdle, but also the sacrum, which is also part of the vertebral column. So the pelvis will be the pelvic girdle plus the ligaments and muscles that lines the pelvic cavity and form the floor of the pelvic cavity. The connection between the part of the coxal bone that is the iliac bone to the sacrum will be forming the sacroiliac joint. So it joins basically the appendicular to the axial skeleton. And this joint happens between the auricular surface of the ilium and the auricular surface of the sacrum. Now anteriorly, the pelvic girdle forms a connection between the 2 pubic bones of the coxal bone, which is called the pubic symphysis. And in here we have a pad of fibrocartilage that is called the interpubic disc. So this is the pelvic girdle. So this is the sacrum. This is the coxal bone. This is the sacroiliac joint between the auricular surface of the sacrum and the auricular surface of the iliac bone, which is this. So this is the ilium, part of the coxal. This is the ischium, and then this is the pubic bone. And in here you have the pelvic inlet. And this part of the coxal bone is called the iliac crest. This will be the iliac fossa. This iliac crest anteriorly ends in the anterior superior iliac spine and the anterior inferior iliac spine. And then within the pelvic inlet, you have the pelvic surface of the sacrum. And then you have the spine of the ischium. This is the spine of the ischium. And then this is the body of the ischium, and this is the ramus. So when we sit in the body of the ischium. And then the ischium has a superior ramus and inferior ramus similar as to the pubic bone. So this is the superior ramus of the pubic bone, this is the inferior ramus, and this will be the pubic symphysis, and then this will be the interpubic disc. And this part in here that it is in between the ischium, the pubic bone, it will be called the obturator foramen. So our pelvis is subdivided into greater or false pelvis and to lesser or true pelvis. The greater pelvis is between flare of the hips, while the lesser pelvis is just below there and it's narrower. Now the pelvic brim will be a round margin that separates this greater and lesser pelvis. And the pelvic inlet will be an opening that helps to form the birth canal, and the pelvic outlet will be the lower margin of the lesser pelvis or the true pelvis. So this is the pelvic brim, and above the pelvic brim in this beige color is the greater pelvis, and below this pelvic brim or pelvic inlet, this will be the lesser pelvis, and this will be the pelvic outlet. while this is the pelvic inlet between the sacral promontory. So here you can see the most prominent part of the S1, which is called the sacral promontory, and then this pelvic inlet runs between the sacral promontory and the inner part of the pubic symphysis, while the pelvic outlet runs between the sacrum and the inferior part of the pubic symphysis internally. So we have within the coxal bone 3 specific features, which are the iliac crest, which is the superior crest of the hip, that sometimes when you are putting your hands over your pelvis, you can feel them. And then you have laterally connecting to the femur, the thigh bone, we have the acetabulum or hip socket. And then we have the obturator foramen, which is a large hole below the acetabulum. And then within the adult, these bones, the ilium, ischium, and pubis, will fuse to form the coxal bone. So this orange bone represents the ilium, the pinkish bone represents the pubis, and the green bone represents the ischium. They all fuse together here in the middle of this fossa that is called the acetabulum. So this is the lateral view of the coxal bone. So this is the iliac crest, this is the anterior superior iliac spine, anterior inferior iliac spine, and then this will be the ala, and then this is the anterior gluteal line. This is the posterior superior iliac spine, posterior inferior iliac spine, posterior gluteal line, and then inferior gluteal line. So gluteal muscles, the muscles of our butt, inserts into here. And then below the posterior inferior iliac spine and in between the ischial spine, you have the greater sciatic notch. So the largest nerve that innervates many muscles in our thigh and in our leg passes through here, the greater sciatic nerve. Now this is the ischial spine, and below the ischial spine we have the lesser sciatic notch, and then this will be the body of the ischium. This is the ischial tuberosity. This is the inferior ramus of the ischium. This will be the superior ramus of the ischium. And then this is the inferior ramus of the pubic bone. This will be the superior ramus. They end into this body of the pubis, and then here we have the pubic tubercle. Some differences in the pelvic girdle. The males have a heavier and thicker pelvic girdle. The females have wider, shallower pelvic girdle that is adapted for pregnancy and childbirth, with a larger inlet and outlet for the passage of the baby's head and the body itself. So this is some of the differences that you can see. So the males have a narrower sciatic notch, greater sciatic notch. They have a tall pubic symphysis. Females have a short pubic symphysis, and then they have a wider sciatic notch. This is the anterior view of the pelvic girdle. So the males have a deeper and greater pelvis, more prominent features. They have a narrow sacrum. The coccyx and the sacrum, they curve more anteriorly in them. They have a triangular body of the pubis, and this pubic angle or subpubic angle in males is acute, less than 90 degrees, while in females is obtuse, greater than 90 degrees. And you have a rectangular body of the pubis, wider sacrum, shallower, greater pelvis with less prominent markings. And then the inlet in females is round, while in males it has kind of a heart shape and it's narrow, and the outlet similarly. Now for the lower limb. The lower limb is subdivided into 4 regions that has 30 bones per limb. So we have the thigh, it is also known as femoral region, so that extends from the hip up to the knee, and it has 2 bones, the femur and the patella. And then we have the leg proper or crural region that extends from the knee up to the ankle, and then it has medially the tibia and laterally it has the fibula. And then we have the foot, that it has three regions. It has a tarsal region, that it is the ankle, that connects the crural region to the foot, and then we have the metatarsal region, which is most of where we have our sole, and then we have the toes or digits that has 14 phalanges. The patella is the only sesamoid bone in our body that we count towards the 206 count of bones. It has a triangular shape with the base facing proximally and the apex facing inferiorly. And this bone is embedded in the tendon of one muscle that is called the quadriceps. It is cartilaginous at birth, but it ossifies at the age of 3 to 6. It has, as I said, this base that it is broad and that faces toward the femur, and it has the apex that faces towards the tibia and it's pointed. And it has these articular facets posteriorly that connects to the femur. And the quadriceps tendon extends from the thigh to the patella and continues as the patellar ligament from the patella into the tibia. So this is the figure showing you the anterior and posterior view of the femur and the patella. So the femur has this head that it is more prominent than the head of the humerus, and in the middle of the head we have a tiny cavity that's called the fovea capitis, and this fovea capitis extends or helps for the connection of the round ligament that connects to the acetabulum in the coxal bone. And then below the head we have the neck, that is just plainly the neck. We don't have a surgical neck or an anatomical neck, just like as the humerus have. And then it has in the anterior view this view of the greater trochanter and the lesser trochanter that looks similar to the greater and lesser tubercles of the humerus, but these are called trochanters. So it's the greater and the lesser trochanter. Now anteriorly you have a connection between the greater and the lesser trochanter. It's called the intertrochanteric line. And then this will be the shaft. And then here, distally, the femur has the lateral condyle and then the lateral epicondyle. And then it has the medial condyle and the medial epicondyle. How can you tell what is medial and what is lateral in the femur? Well, you have to look proximally. And the part that it has the head, or the side that it has the head, that will be the medial side. And then here anteriorly and proximally, the femur has the patellar surface, that it has this hyaline cartilage so that the articular facets of the patella can connect. Now this is the base of the patella and this is the apex. And then posteriorly you can see in the proximal part the greater and the lesser trochanter, the head, the neck, the fovea capitis, and then this projection in between the greater and the lesser trochanter that is called the intertrochanteric crest, which is more wider than the line. So the line is anterior and the crest is posterior. And then following this intertrochanteric crest, this roughnut projection, it is called the gluteal tuberosity. And then you have the spiral line and the linea aspera. All of these are markings that allows you to insert several muscles. And then you have this linea aspera continues with the lateral and medial supracondylar lines. And then in here you have the popliteal surface of the femur. And then you have the lateral condyle and the medial condyle with fossa in between that is called the intercondylar fossa. And then you have the lateral epicondyle and the medial epicondyle. And this is the posterior view of the patella with the articular facets. So for the tibia and the fibula, they have a proximal connection that is called the proximal tibiofibular joint, and then this inferior connection that is called the distal fibular joint. And this is the shaft of both bones. So the tibia is stronger, is thicker, is medial, and then the fibula is lateral and it is less stronger, it's a thin bone, and then in between you have the interosseous membrane. This will be the shin of the tibia, the anterior border, and then here you have the tibial tuberosity. And you have this medial condyle and this lateral condyle, and in the superior part of the medial and the lateral condyle you have the intercondylar eminence. And then in here you have the head of the fibula. This is the shaft, and this will be the lateral malleolus, the lateral bone of our ankle. And then this will be the medial malleolus of the tibia, which is the medial bone that you can feel in your ankle. So how can you tell in the tibia which is the medial condyle versus the lateral condyle? You have to look distally. So the medial malleolus is found in the tibia because the tibia is medial, and then the lateral malleolus is part of the fibula. So if you look above or proximally, this will have to be then the medial condyle. And then here you have the head of the fibula in the posterior view with the apex, and then this is the lateral malleolus. Now for the ankle and the foot. So the tarsal bones are found in the ankle. They differ from the carpal bones because you have load-bearing function of the ankle. So these bones, instead of being tiny, they're wide and strong. With the largest tarsal bone will be the calcaneus that forms the heel. This is where you have a point of attachment for a muscle through a tendon that is called the calcaneal or Achilles tendon. Now the talus is the most superior tarsal bone, and it forms the taro-crural joint between the talus with the tibia and the fibula. This will sit upon the calcaneus and will articulate with a bone that is called the navicular. So we have a proximal row of tarsal bones. We have talus, calcaneus, and navicular. And then the distal row will be medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiforms, and the cuboid. The rest of the foot bones will resemble the hand bones in name and arrangement. So we don't have a special name, so you don't have to worry so much. It's just naming from medial to lateral with Roman numerals from 1 through 5. So metatarsal 1 is proximal to the great toe, the hallux, for the metatarsals. Then metatarsal 5 is proximal to the little toe. And of course the rest you have it in between. And then the metatarsal, they have also a base that is proximal. They have a body or shaft that is intermediate, and they have a distal head. And then the phalanges, you have two. In the great toe, you have the proximal and distal phalange, and then you have 3 on the other toes. So you have proximal, middle, and distal phalange. So this is how the ankle and the foot look like, the bones. So this will be the calcaneus, the heel bone, the superior and inferior view. Then this will be the talus that forms connection to the tibia and the fibula, but especially the tibia. And then the talus connects to the navicular, which is this rectangular shape bone that looks like a chip. Navicular means chip. And then you have the cuboid that connects the calcaneus in here, and then just distal to the navicular, you have the cuneiform. So you have medial, intermediate, and lateral cuneiform, or first, second, and third cuneiforms. And then this is the inferior view. So these are the cuneiform first, second, and third, or medial, intermediate, lateral, and this will be the cuboid, and this will be the navicular. And then you have the metatarsals with the base proximal, the body medial, and then the head distal. So you have first, second, third, fourth, and fifth, first, second, third, fourth, and fifth with Roman numerals. And then you have the phalanges proximal and distal for the great toe, and then for the rest will be proximal row of phalanges, middle row of phalanges, and distal row. And this is the lateral view. So you can see here the calcaneus, the talus, navicular, then the cuneiforms, the metatarsals, the phalanges, and at the base of the great toes and also at the base of the pollex in these tendons we have sesamoid bones that don't count towards the number of bones within the skeleton. So the sole of the foot is not flat on the ground. It has arches that helps to absorb stretch. So we have a medial longitudinal arch that runs from the heel to the hallux. And then it's formed from the calcaneus, talus, navicular, cuneiforms, metatarsals 1 through 3. And then we have the lateral longitudinal arch that runs from the heel to the little toe and includes calcaneus, cuboid, metatarsals 5 and 5th. And then we have a transverse arch that runs from lateral to medial across the middle of the foot that includes the cuboid, the cuneiforms, all the three of them, the proximal head of the metatarsals, and the arches are held together by short and strong ligaments like these ligaments that connects the metatarsals. Now, if someone has flat feet, it's called a pes planus. It's because a person might have genetics for it, and it might have excessive weight. It has repetitive stress, or as I said, it can be congenital. So this will be the arches of the foot. So this is the inferior view. So this is the medial arch going from these bones up to here, up to the third phalange or metatarsal, and this will be the lateral arch, and this will be the transverse arch. So this is all for this chapter. Feel free to email me any questions, and I will see you in the next chapter. Have a good day or have a good night. Bye-bye.